Welcome to the Art of Writing Letters. I am Sammy Crusoe, a community librarian at Deschutes Public Library, and today I hopefully am going to share with you my love of writing letters and get you to write as well. So I'm going to emphasize the fact that in this title it says the art of writing letters because letter writing is really something that you have to practice, much like art. And rarely does it just come second nature. And there's also a ton of fun ways that you can jazz up your letter writing in artistic ways. A little bit about myself and my journey with letters. I have been a pen pal for over 11 years with my best friend, and it happened. We were on a trip together. We were both writing letters home to our friends and family and talking about how much we actually really enjoy writing letters ourselves, and even more so, how we enjoy receiving letters as well. So it started from there and it has continued ever since. And it's been a wonderful way for me to continue connecting to her. Now, this past year, I've actually used letter writing a lot to connect with my friends and family since I haven't been able to see them as much or at all in person. And I found that it's been a simple way for me to let them know that I'm thinking of them, and I'm hoping that it has brought a smile to their face as well. Before we dive into the content, I'd like to start with a call to action, and actually just to let you know that this entire presentation is really a call to action. I want to get you letter writing at the end of this if you aren't already. So really, it's kind of just a return to letter writing because letter writing has been around for so long. I would love to start out with a little quote that I found in a book that I've been reading from the library that's called To the Letter. Here it goes. Letters have the power to grant us a larger life. They reveal motivation and deepen understanding. They are evidential. They change lives and they rewire history. The world once used to run upon their transmission. It must seem impossible that their worth would ever be taken for granted or swept aside. A world without letters would surely be a world without oxygen. So keeping that in mind, I just want to say that letters have been used for centuries and centuries and centuries for people to connect with each other who are not readily at hand. And sometimes for those who are nearby and they just want to have a more intimate, personal way to connect with them. Letters are personal, honest, intimate, and they're a really unique record of time. So if that didn't get you going to start writing letters, if nothing else, write letters so you can balance the junk mail in somebody's mailbox. Together, we are going to look at briefly the history of letters and communication, the purpose behind writing letters, the format, the standard format for writing letters, and then the design so you can get flowing. Before we jump in too far, I would like to acknowledge who has been excluded from the history of letters as well as from the historical record at large. And to do this, I'm going to share a quote from an article from Newsweek, History and Lost Art of Letter Writing. Here we go. Gaps in the historical record have always existed. Enslaved Americans were largely illiterate, often by law, and sometimes by laws that threatened them with death. The epistolary record belongs to free people, and in most cases, that means free white people of property. When we reflect on how dearly we would cherish written letters by people in bondage or any people who, through some circumstance of history, were voiceless, we begin to grasp the preciousness of the written record, any written record, laundry lists, ancestral records and family Bibles, love notes, and how poorly historians of the future will be served by our generation, which generates almost no mail at all. So I want you to keep this in mind, that people who have been enslaved throughout history, poor individuals, and those who are illiterate, often having been kept from education, are excluded largely from the history of letter writing and the historical record. So as we move into the history, keep that in mind about who is centered in this story in history and who isn't. And keep that in mind as you're writing your own letters. Maybe that'll spur something as well. In order to talk about the history of letters and letter writing, we have to include the history of communication and communication technology. For instance, we wouldn't have letters without writing. Also, many of these things that I'm going to touch on really have influenced how we communicate and write today. For writing, it was established in Mesopotamia as cuneiform in about 3400 BC. Letters are actually believed to have begun being written shortly thereafter from one person to another in order to share information and news. The Postal Service also shortly there was created, and it's not like the Postal Service we know today. They were personal messengers for kings and emperors to get information from one to another. Religious orders and universities also jumped on that bandwagon. Eventually, relay stations were organized to ensure the speed and organization of delivery. Then, as we move forward throughout history, more and more public systems were organized so private individuals could use them to communicate without having to have a lot of money to use those private systems. During the 17th and 18th century, there were postal agreements ensuring the delivery of mail between different countries. By the 19th century, this was so complex that an international postal service had to be created, and I mean, we all know that international mail can be quite complex even to this day. The earliest piece of surviving mail dates back to 255 BC in Egypt. You'll notice on this timeline, there's a huge chunk of time that is not included, and that's because there's so many things that happened during this time, but they're not quite the ones that we want to look at for communication, and you'll see why here in a second. So in the 1830s, we have the invention of the telegraph, which died out in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and actually the last telegraphs were shut down in the early 2000s. Then we have the invention of the telephone in 1876, the internet in the 1960s, the smartphone in the 1990s. You'll notice all of these actually cut out on my timeline in the 21st century, and I think that's because we need to acknowledge that none of these are guaranteed to continue as we move forward throughout time. For instance, the Postal Service here in the United States was threatened earlier in 2020. So keep writing those letters and help funding our Postal Service. But I think that as you look at these different pieces of technology and communication aspects, you'll notice how time and ease of communication has really influenced all of them. So you have the Postal Service, so information could be delivered faster. You have the telegraph, so it could be delivered almost immediately. You have the telephone, which then allowed two people to communicate instantaneously. The internet, so that you could communicate with anybody anywhere, get your information on a dime as well. And then smartphones, so you could have it with you wherever you happened to be. So all of that has really influenced how we write, why we write, and what we write. Now let's look at letters over time. They began as a way to simply pass information and news from one person to another. They were incredibly rigid and lacked personal detail whatsoever. But they've adapted over time, as you can tell by the letters that you receive. This is due in part due to the communication advances that we just learned about, but also to many people and periods along the way. And of course, literacy. So let's look at that. Literacy is obviously the ability to read and understand information on the page and to communicate that as well. So go back in time. Literacy was highly valued in ancient Rome. They were writing books, they had reports and calendars and lots of different rosters for their militaries and army. And it's believed, although this is controversial, that 5 to 10% of the population of the time was literate. And what's interesting about this is this was supposedly across different groups of people. So different political and social standings were literate. Now as we move through time, the church actually gained and held control over literacy. And as you look at specific periods of time, much of the writing that was produced was theological. The church required their priests to be literate and actually rewarded those with classical educations with elite positions. And if we look specifically at the Dark Ages, as high as 25% of the population was literate. And so this can be attributed to that control of education and power, and those who were able to access education being predominantly those with money and those in high political and social standings. As we move forward, we move into the Renaissance, which was a period of growth and knowledge, which was fueled by the values of antiquity due to a return to the classics and a rediscovery of many artifacts, which in turn fueled artistic and cultural changes, including education, which expanded. It is believed that as high as 40% of the population during this time was literate. Now let's fast forward to today, or to 2015. And at this time, UNESCO published a report that said about 86% of people 15 and older were literate. So obviously if you look at this is still due to a lack of access to education and resources to many people across the world. Okay, so that's literacy. Now let's move along to a handful of people and their surviving letters, which have had a huge impact on the way in which we write letters today. I'll let you know now, these are all men. I mean, if we look at history, predominantly men are the ones whose records have been preserved and continued and brought to the surface. Also, many of these are Roman, so let's get going. We're going to start with Marcus Tullius Cicero, who was a Roman politician who wrote over 900 letters in his lifetime. He communicated widely with figures at a time when Rome was in decline. So it is a really interesting record of a specific place and period in time. And his writing was actually discovered in a cathedral in Verona and Vercelli at the beginning of the Renaissance. So you can see how that might have influenced how things moved throughout the Renaissance. Next up, we have Seneca the Younger. He was a Roman Stoic philosopher and many, many, many other things. But he wrote actually in a more self-help manner, whereas if you put them all together, you might get an instructional book or a self-help book, but definitely different than other writings at the time. Next, we have Pliny the Younger, who was a Roman philosopher or politician as well. Stylistically, he wrote in a very similar manner to how we do today. It was incredibly intimate and very loving. He actually published a lot of his personal and professional letters during his life, and many more were published thereafter. He includes in his collection of letters is included an eyewitness account of the explosion of Mount Vesuvius at Pompeii, which is a really unique way to see how letters can influence and impact the historical record. Next, we're going to look at Marcus Aurelius, who was the Roman emperor, and his letters are incredibly intimate between him and his teacher, actually. And they were found under the writings of the acts of the First Council of Chalcedon. And I'm going to mess up this next word, but this technique that was used is a palimpsest, which they wipe a scroll or a document from its original writing so that they can use it again to write on. So at the time, they learned how to actually read what was underneath originally. During the Renaissance period, they learned this technique. Next, I would like to note, we're going to fast forward a little bit in time to Petrarch, who lived at the end of the Dark Ages, beginning of the Renaissance, who actually coined the term Dark Ages. And he was an Italian scholar and poet. And he wrote prolifically because he traveled throughout Europe and made many friends and acquaintances along the way. And he wrote every day to many of them. And he was actually inspired by many of the people that were identified above. So if you think about how the fact that he lived during the Renaissance and how he was influenced by that writing, you can see that the way that letters have changed throughout history. I mean, obviously, we started with informational and newsworthy letters. Then we moved more into more personal accounts of a time, of a specific time. And then we have more instructional and personal, intimate letters, followed by this prolific writing. And so if you think about how you write today, you might see some of your styles and the reasons why you write reflected in some of these older writings as well. Now that we've looked at the history of writing letters, we're going to move into the formats and the purposes behind writing letters. So, the purpose. There are many different types of letters. We have personal, social, and business letters, and these move from an informal tone to a more formal tone. So focusing on personal, these are the informal letters. They are friendly, informational, they share thoughts, feelings, and experiences. Some examples are love letters and pen pals. Pretty much most of the letters that you probably are writing. Then we have social letters, and these can range from informal to formal. They're purposeful. There is definitely a reason for why they exist. So these include invitations, RSVPs, congratulation letters, thank you notes, and condolences. Definitely something that I partake in, especially with my thank you notes. Then we move to the even more formal, and those are the business letters. Those are purposeful and they are very commonly formulaic. They include cover letters, recommendations, inquiries and follow-up letters, as well as sales and offers. Those are the ones that I don't love writing, but definitely have a place in this world. Moving forward, we're going to focus mostly on the personal with a little bit of the social formats. Okay, looking at the general format for a letter, there's a handful of things I want to point out. You want to include the date. Why? Because sometimes it takes a while for a letter to get there, and things change in the world. We have other means of communication, so it's possible that things become outdated between when you write and send your letter to when it's received. Also, it's nice to let people know when you were thinking of them. Next up, we have a salutation. I love to start it out with dear or hi, or use the love name, something to address the letter and get it going. Sometimes it sets the mood even. Next up, you have your body. This is the meat of your letter. This is what you're including. This is why you're writing. And this is oftentimes the hardest part because remembering or figuring out what you want to write is a challenge. Then you have your signature. You could say love. You could say best wishes. You could say sincerely. However you want to do it, make sure you just include your name underneath. Obviously, you want people to know who has taken the time to reach out to them. Couple tips here. I'd recommend writing with a purpose, quality over quantity, and keep it neat. Make sure that they can actually read what you're writing. Next up, we have the general format for an envelope. There is a formula for almost everything. You put the return address in the top left-hand corner in case you are like me and you forget to put a stamp on your letter when you send it. That happened recently and I felt very foolish, but I was very happy that it ended up back in my mailbox. Then you want to make sure to include that stamp, typically the right-hand corner, although there's some wiggle room there. Then you have the meat of the envelope. You have your recipient's address. This is the most important part. It's so you know that that letter is going to get where it needs to go. So make sure you're writing clearly. You need to have their name, their street address, their city, state, zip code, and make sure to include here the country in case you are sending it outside of the United States. And if you are, I highly recommend Googling the proper format for sending letters to that country. And if you're doing that, make sure you include extra stamps because usually it costs more to send internationally. Also, one thing more on stamps, I love to use forever stamps because they don't go bad ever. So oftentimes the cost of stamps goes up. And if you happen to have stamps with an old number on it, you have to get more stamps to make up that difference. Forever stamps work no matter how much a stamp actually costs today. Next up, I would love to share with you some prompts so you can find your flow and get writing. I'm going to share some traditional ones and then some more creative ones. I think the hardest part of writing letters is just getting started. But if you take your time and you practice and you write with a purpose, you'll get going and you'll never stop. But again, keep those tips in mind. The purpose, quality over quantity, and keep it neat. Maybe even write it out before you transfer it onto that final product. So here are some of the traditional prompts that I like to use oftentimes in my own letter writing. I like to start off with a story, remember when, and share a moment that you had with the recipient before. You could ask questions, get them going, and maybe that would prompt a response back to you. You could share advice. Maybe you know something's happening in their life that you've been through that you want to share advice on. Or maybe you've learned something recently that you need to share some advice with. Maybe you need to say thank you for something. Maybe they've done something for you recently, or maybe just for their friendship. Share what you love about them. That kind of goes hand in hand with a thank you letter. Or maybe one thing that always reminds you of them. So, for instance, when I see somebody with curly hair, I am immediately reminded of my best friend. Some more creative options are you could make an ad lib where you write a story or a letter and you put in some blanks, don't write the word, and you have the recipient fill in with nouns, adjectives, just like a regular ad lib. You could print out a picture and share it with your recipient. Maybe it's of you two, maybe it's of something that you recently took, and you just want to write about it and share. You could plan a future trip together. I haven't done this one, but I think that sounds like a lot of fun and also total chaos as happening via a letter. You could share or recommend a favorite book, a show, a podcast, a recipe, whatever you want, something. You could just creating that personal connection is always a great way to start. Next up, my favorite is affirmations and positivity. I recently did this with a bunch of my Galentines where I shared all of my favorite things about my friends and why they were so positive, how they are so positive and wonderful people. You could get creative and write about how it feels to actually write a letter. And maybe you could ask even how it feels to receive a letter. Or another option, you could draw a picture. And maybe you do it as like a Frankenstein monster and have them draw and send it back to you. If you still aren't feeling quite inspired, I highly recommend checking out Creative Bug. You have access to this resource with your library card, which you can access through the library's Resource and Learning tab. And I highly recommend watching one of the videos. You'll search for the art of letter writing, and you can see a little picture from this class. But it's a really wonderful class that will inspire you to be more creative with your envelopes and your letters and get you going, and hopefully just be that little thing to get you going if nothing else has thus far. I think it's super fun, and it's definitely something that I am trying to incorporate in my own letters, and in particular, here's some inspiration that I would love to share. These are a bunch of different envelopes that people have created. The one that I'm actually covering up is an example that is from the video, actually, where she put a little bit of paint on the envelope, used a credit card, and smeared it off of the envelope, and then was able to write with a gel pen over. So these are just kind of some simple ones, but they're definitely a fun way to make it a little bit more interesting. It's unfortunate that envelopes are typically the piece that are thrown away, but maybe it'll keep them and make it so your recipient keeps them, or even just maybe prompt them to send you a letter back. Here's a little bit more inspiration. These ones are a lot more exciting. Some I don't think that I could achieve, although a few of these I think that are doable. And so I highly recommend trying out a couple of these and seeing, maybe just starting with the envelope and seeing where that leads you, just that little extra inspiration to get you going. Okay, here's a tiny bit more of inspiration, just in case you still haven't gotten there. I'm going to share a handful of things with you. You saw my whole stack of letters, and there's so many different things that have got me going in my writing to my friend over the years. But some of it is simply just having some wonderful stationery and cards. Something blank is phenomenal. For instance, I just wrote a card. I just created a card. It says, change is on the horizon. And a simple drawing. It's nothing exciting, or it's nothing too flashy, but it's something that is fun. I was able to put my own spin on it, and I'm excited to write the letter now. Maybe stationery is more your sort, so you can kind of set your own tone. Something that's a little bit nostalgic, maybe a little bit flashy. Maybe a postcard is more the speed that you need, a little bit shorter. This one's a literary one with Emily Bronte. Maybe an artistic card. This is really cool. Wood rounds. More postcards of art and talk about it. Maybe you find your favorite artist who also makes postcards and in wonderful prints that then you can share with your friends. And then don't forget, you always have your congratulations and thank you notes, which you can share. And that's definitely a simple way to just send a letter. And, I even took a little bit of inspiration from the Creative Book class, and I'm ready to send a letter to my Sunriver Library friends and just tell them how much I appreciate them. So here it is all addressed. I had a little bit of fun adding in some different stylistic writing. Sorry, this is backwards. But I look forward to sending that to them. You can even use some special tools like an envelope address template where you can kind of make sure that everything is lined up properly. You could even use some fancy pens and markers and pencils. You can use some graph paper to make sure that your writing is proper and that you get all out that you are interested in getting out before you write it on your final product. There's so many different things that you can do to just kind of have fun, be a little bit more artistic. I think one thing that has come out of all the different ways in which people have written in the past is that you get to control what you want to write about. You can be as creative or as not as you want. And you could stick to those formulas, or you can draw a beautiful picture, or maybe just write 3 words. Whatever you want to do, you can, because it's your letter. And I think that it's really going to make somebody's day. So thank you so much for tuning in. I had a lot of fun talking about the art of writing letters with you. I hope that you go out and write your own letters and send a little bit of love through the mail. I'm Sammy Cruzel. This is Deschutes Public Library, and thank you so much for tuning in.